Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Disc Guidance segment with 2MK Team. Today we are, once again, looking at the close to final UNIST bot content. We're reasonably sure that we will not be making much more complex bots for this game, at least not in the near future, as we keep wanting to keep the input simple because of how UNIST saves bots. And having brought it down to the final three, Eltnum, Mika, and Enkidu, we've been poking at it a bit and have concluded that it's unlikely that Eltnum is going to share inputs with the other two. We were quite hoping for it, but nope, doesn't look that way this time. In fact, our work on the Eltnum bot has indicated that we have quite a ways to go, so you're going to see her in probably about 2 weeks, particularly because we will all be available next week. Therefore, we'll be going through all of the normal things, showing you, talking about the game itself a bit, as these are two good characters to do so with. And two functionally good bots to do the work with. As always, we will also be giving you the inputs around 30 minutes into the stream in advance of the bot's release on Sunday. If you want to poke at them, use them, or help us test them out just in case there's anything that doesn't go so well, either because it's not clear from what we say, or because you just have a different timing in your rhythm of inputs and it doesn't work out as well. Feel free to contact us, as always, to let us know. We're starting with Mika, even though she's the more complex of the two. Despite being a really simple character, she doesn't even have Vorpal, which is useful in a sense because it means she gets to use her force function. Not the greatest move in the world, honestly, but if you don't feel the need to deny your opponents having their Vorpal, then she can sometimes get quite a lot out of it. Mika game plans vary fairly heavily. She doesn't follow a lot of rules, and most of what you need to understand about her comes in seeing her motions and recognizing that she can do certain things you might not be expecting. The rest is reactions and keeping all of her options in mind. So let's review some of those options so that you start to understand, even before we go into the later point systems and why they're difficult, just talking a little bit about why the bot is designed the way it is. Mika's built to be able to close space really suddenly, but not necessarily to dash in on you too often to do it. Or if she doesn't tend to dash just raw without attacking most of the time. But because she's so good at approaching without necessarily leaving herself completely open, you have to respect her quite a lot, which means that she actually does get to build up quite a bit of meter if you're defensive, and at least deny you your own Vorpal. If you put her into block stun, the current design of the bot means that she has some, let's call them detection, built in, that will let her do her specials, but generally she won't do them as just a standard motion. This helps you to get used to it because, as with almost all our other inputs of this bot, the problem was that she was doing far too much of her specials, which aren't really the best of moves to be hitting in neutral unless you're ready to commit to them. She doesn't have a really good reason to do most of this though, so instead we built the form of the bot where she is using her big buttons and specific spacings to get advantages constantly. Even against long-range characters like Yuzu, who can most of the time just hit her out of stuff, she can be still enough of a stressor because she tends to trade, and she can change her air vectors fairly quickly. She can't change them to a bunch of complicated things very easily, although the bot does not generally have too much air assault, She does have some of it, and you do have to be careful of it. The main things you're concerned about are, again, her force function, which, while it is an extremely easy move to see coming, relatively easy move to block, she has some limited ability to cancel other moves out of it if you're the type that mashes, and she's not really that unsafe for doing it against most characters. If you move in to punish her too quickly, she can often cancel to hit you instead. This move is, however, not the greatest. It is not particularly threatening. And it is very negative. The charged version of this move is an overhead. We did not necessarily put in the overhead version, partially because it only does it from the air anyway, and it's mostly for helping her keep her combos going. But it is somewhat a spacing tool. It is enough to get people to try to do things to her that don't make sense, or to just help her get out of situations where the opponent might want to punish her. And early on in your play, this is kind of important. The ability for her to poke at you a couple times and then just decide, I don't want to be here, I want to be away from you now, because you're just a character who will do a ton of damage to me. But I should finish my combo with this. And while it's, again, quite easy to actually deal with this, to actually punish it in terms of frame data, you still have to get used to it. Depending on your input of the bot on any given day, she may cancel this move less. But that's kind of helpful because it will help you shift your perspective on whether or not you should be trying to punish it in the first place. Her other approach moves are her dashing C, her 6-6C, which is also a move that has to be blocked standing. And is actually only -9, which sounds like it's fairly easy to deal with, but if you're not correct on the timing and understand when she is actually recovered, you might fall a little short of your expected punish. But above all else, you have to understand that she does not have problems getting in on a person who isn't able to switch their defense up quite quickly. This move has a really oppressive hitbox. Like, it's specifically said on the wiki, this move has a really oppressive hitbox. Covers basically the entire screen, and doesn't really get telegraphed all that well. It starts a lot of combos, etc, etc. However, she whiffs this move pretty hard, so be a little bit careful with it. You also can't hit her with lows while she's doing it. At least, by the time you recognize that she's doing it, you probably can't hit her with lows anymore. So you do have to consider that at least a bit. Another great move for avoiding and ignoring your low attacks altogether is that little forward leap you see her do, her 3B. Her 3B, unlike her 6-6C, has a lot of active frames, and because it has a lot of active frames, it means that she has the potential to make it all the way to plus. It's not necessarily the easiest thing to do, and it only gets up to +2, but it's often a move you will want to shield just to prevent yourself from having problems. Fortunately, it can be blocked mid, which means it can be shielded both high and low. Just know that when this move is coming at you, you shouldn't just assume that you can punish with whatever you like. You have to pay attention to where she was, how high she hit you, etc. and catching her out of it is actually fairly difficult for many characters. You can try to do it, and that can be one of the greater challenges of it, but it starts up in 13. This is quite a fast move, so you're not likely to be reacting to it, but rather to the spacing that your opponent wants to do it at. In the bot, this is unlikely to be helpful to you, meaning that it will probably prepare you better for dealing with opponents who know how to space it really well. There are a couple of very advanced uses of this bot involving fuzzy guarding and OSs. That's my suggestion to you if you have heard about all these different cool OSs that you should be able to do in UNIST. This is usually the sort of bot you want to test it on, as her timings and block stun make it harder to get your OS at the right time while still feeling confident. She does have both regular and command grabs, and you get points for teching both of them. Even easier based on the fact that often she does things such that she will put you in the gold sort of grab, which means it's easier to tech out of it. But again, not always. Sometimes you make a mistake, you whiff in some way, and she gets to get you. Her throw is fairly hidden though, so in the case of this bot, that basically will be a very close approximation to her actual point system. She's mostly just learn punishes, learn to execute your OS, learn to understand your opponent's spacing and what it means for your execution. However, we will switch now to Akatsuki versus Mika to demonstrate one or two other things she can do that can be frustrating or difficult for zoning characters. Note that this is not really a demonstration of full fighting of this type, because against a bot, one generally tends to zone fairly well. We're just going to have Akatsuki throw a ton of projectiles, and occasionally Mika will do something that helps you understand the point. She's among the better characters at jumping over projectiles because she has even more options than most. She can pull back her hurt boxes quite a lot. She can do certain charged moves in the air that are a big deal. She can come back down with her force function, and she can just punch the projectiles. This is super important when you think about zoning her from very far away. And I don't mean just with the explosive off of her, the second part of her standing B, which you are seeing, but rather that almost all of her charged C buttons will just seemingly cancel projectiles. The consistency of this is relatively good. She can occasionally land on it, but those two moves should definitely be considered important for this purpose. She can get through a ton of things, get over a lot of things, and depending on how you put out your projectiles and where you try to play from, she will just ignore you, meaning that if she gets the life lead, you don't have a way to just make her miserable this way. But she was cooperative and demonstrated both the things in question quite early, so we're going back into actually demonstrating how the character has to flow as a standard thing. This bot doesn't block as much as some, but is decent in the blocking department, which is particularly meaningful because of the need to do your OS and your anti-airs and so on perfectly. If you have defensive force functions, this is a definite good time to be trying to use them in various ways, as well as perfectly shielding some positions, and if you have done those things, then you get some whiff punishes. She's not an easy character to whiff punish as a standard thing, but she does tend to move and extend hurt boxes at the end of block strings in ways that shielding or understanding her range, understanding how far away from her to walk while she's recovering, and so on, will allow you to get some whiff punishes if she just wants to stick out buttons in the hopes that she keeps on hitting you. So you can use it in this way to get some experience with this both on specials and normals. Her tendency to barely whiff things can teach a player to react to whiffs much faster, and this is a really important skill in fighting games as you get higher and higher, because it's quite often that we see the opponent do something, realize that we could whiff punish it, but don't in time, and they either block, or worse, they end up whiff punishing us because they were the one who were in the middle of their own move. They saw it happen, and they're more used to it because they were the offensive player. They were looking for you to whiff your punish to their stuff so that they could then whiff punish that. So once again, we will get back to the full point system, although I've technically more or less already explained it, later on in the stream with some more demonstrations. But in all this talk about whiff punishing, we are headed over to Akatsuki versus Enkidu. Enkidu is an easy character to fight for many reasons. Not to downplay him too much, but we have spoken before on the design of the character, the fact that most people can't say with strong feelings this is a good character in this game, but many people have the opinion he is a bad character in this game. He's just a very different character in this game. At the very least, you have to think of it in that way. He isn't really playing the same game as the other characters quite. He lacks a couple of abilities for that purpose. That said, if you know how to play him and how to manipulate the thoughts and reactions of others, he has basically all the tools required to dismantle the sort of person who doesn't have their own game plan fully intact. Meaning that it's really only at the very highest levels of the game, or at the very lowest levels of the game, where Enkidu is quote-unquote weak, in comparison to other characters played by similar skills levels of people. But you do have the problem of occasionally this not being a popular character, and therefore you end up facing an Enkidu who knows what they're doing and manipulates you, but you don't know anything about him. So our goal here is to make sure you know at least enough about him to understand why he does certain things, as it's easy to get the impression he's just not good, he doesn't do anything in particular. He does a lot of things in particular, it's that the things are easy to deal with mostly once you understand them. So let's go into how to understand them. The first is that his force function, his tidal spin, that super punishable move that sends him spiraling into the air, is actually a low. At least the first hit thereof. He also has a good long low in another form, but just generally having to deal with the fact that he can just do this and cancel a ton of things out of it shouldn't be any different from any other move from any other character. Just, okay, it's a low. It doesn't look like a low, but as soon as you get the idea that somehow, oh, this thing is something to be blocked low, that's fine, because most of the time you're blocking low anyway. But it does matter in very specific positions, because he's not the sort of character that you think of lows a lot on. More importantly, we have given the bot the capacity, though not 100% of the time, to cancel that move if it is blocked into his parry, so you can't mash out of it either. And this is the best we can find, especially given that it shares with MikaBot, to simulating what you actually need to understand about Enkidu as a character. Enkidu has a lot of things where he can change the frame timing of things he does to catch you mashing. And furthermore, sometimes he can cancel these things into the parry so that he lets you do the mashing and then hits you for it. The whiff punishing from before was mentioned because he has a very special ability based on just being different. When Enkidu does land a whiff punish or a counter hit, he has an extra effect. Basically, he just straight up does more damage, but it also puts the opponent in longer hit stun, meaning that he can get combos that he can't normally get. This is not super useful for a bot. This is more so the sort of thing Enkidu players need to learn how to do properly, but it's still something you have to think about and understand, because he is a strong whiff punish character that has good footsies. Your main goal against him, therefore, is to recognize when you're being set up due to your tendencies and resist the urge, or learn to deal with him from there. So we've done our best to make sure that he doesn't just do the spin constantly, but he's still going to do it fairly often, and he can cancel certain parts of it, especially with good timing, into at least the parry, if not a couple other things. Of course, he will also anti-air, and this move is invincible to air normals, but it's not really the strongest of things you care about here. One of the things you do care about is the fact that he tends to move forward when he does it in ways that might make you think you should back out. And because you constantly want to adjust your spacing against this character, it's relatively easy for that to happen. On top of that, he has the very helpful fact that he just has an overhead. In fact, he has multiple overheads. We've only given the bot one of these overheads, but he does have some others you may need to pay attention to. The axe kick style stomp you see is in fact an overhead in the kick part, but is notably not necessarily an overhead if the big wave that is coming out is hitting you. This is usually not really useful, because if you were positioned correctly by the Enkidu player, i.e. to their advantage, you aren't really going to have the option there anyway. The bot should be able to, in the same situations, do both that charged overhead style move or an actual low at approximately the same timings, so you don't know. Once he's put you in the right placing on screen, you don't know whether to not to block high or low, except for the fact that it's a long startup move. The overhead version, the charged 6C that you're seeing, starts up in a really long 27 frames, and it's like -10. This is not a threatening move in itself. It is only in combination with Enkidu's other tactics that this is something you have to think about. And if you can get to the point where you don't have to think about it and you just automatically block it, as I'm sure you're familiar with from our many discussions on Just Vine's ability to just automatically block overheads, it's not that threatening a thing. However, it does once again show you all of the spacing and understanding requirements of this game, as well as the high speed at which it happens. He also counters often enough to help with a particular aspect of Enkidu as a character that is generally considered a weakness. Enkidu's counters and parries don't always interact the same way with moves. For certain characters, he actually does the parry fairly often, and for some characters, he kind of matters as to how far away they are. He'll protect himself from the strike, but won't always counterattack, meaning that you can get stuff on him afterwards in the scramble before anything much happens. Honestly though, he's a simple character. We expect him to be classed as an easy bot. His 6C, as mentioned, is basically a running thing, foot invincible, similar to Mika's. So you do have to worry about it a little bit, but it can also be blocked mid and it's like -15, so it's not even hard to punish or anything. You just block it and punish it, and that's it. He can get himself to a specific spacing where he could almost make it good, but the situation you would have to be in for this move to be not super negative is one that you'd probably learn by fighting the bot specifically. In general, though, the chances that he's going to hit you with the edge of this move in such a way that you won't be able to punish him quite heavily is quite small. While he does have decent specials, we have basically given him nearly none of them, just as Mika has nearly none of hers. He can be changed very slightly. He will have a variant on the site that gives him his 2A, which is slightly better. But his 2A is not the best for doing certain things, as while it is a low, he does have other lows that can be done well by spacing them very far. His 2C, for example, which you are constantly seeing here, is a really negative move, but that hasn't really stopped it from being a fairly good one. He is also a very good character for the same purpose as Mika, dealing with learning what happens when you OS against an opponent who does certain things. It's all well and good to understand a ton of OS, but if your opponent spaces themselves correctly, they can't necessarily invalidate these OS, but they can make you end up doing things you didn't expect to do, strange things, or just make you feel that constant strain of using your option select every time and getting tired because your opponent just somehow never falls for it, or doesn't really seem to care if you do it or not. And since he has the counter in the same space, if he spaces himself well enough, he can actually beat your OS just because he has the counter and has parried and has cancelled into it from something. The bot has specifically been given this ability, and fortunately we are really confident that as long as you can get him to parry at all, the timing for it should be correct. Other than that, he's got a couple good normals and normal spacings related to this, and you can use this to get used to the character as a whole. Therefore, time for us to make a switch and to start talking about inputs. So we'll have Kansuki Dynasty take over the playing aspect. And we will go through, let's go with Mika again, because it's easier a little bit to clarify what's going on in terms of inputs, as Enkidu actually doesn't have all of the same inputs to demonstrate what is actually going on. These inputs are basically completely final, and you don't have to worry about them being changed between now and bot release. However, the variants will not necessarily be mentioned. So, starting with action 1. This is the only variant I will mention. This is 4A, 1B, 2-3 end. So you're going to down forward. This is a kind of hard input if you're not used to doing a crouching move directly after a standing A, but it's not all that bad. Generally, even if you did not get it right, she probably still wouldn't do any specials. Fortunately, once you do have it right, it doesn't tend to be too complicated to repeat, so you're good to go. 4A, 1B, 2-3 end. The variant of this is to simply do the 4 right after the 1. You do 1A, go up to 4 for a moment, back down to 1, B, 2, 3, end. This is much harder, but does help a little bit with specific aspects of certain things. If you do it perfectly right, it will end up doing some weird negative edge OS, and mostly is important for giving Enkidu his 2A. But again, this is not really high priority at all, and despite the fact that his 5A isn't great, you really might not want to consider it for Mika too much, as her 5A is quite good, honestly. On to Action 2, therefore. Fortunately, Action 2 is super simple. Action 2 is a 3B with a hidden dash in it, and end. And if you replay it by itself, if your timing is good, it should be around 25 to 29 frames. She'll really more or less just repeat the 3B thing. She should generally have a dash in here, but honestly, it doesn't always matter even if she doesn't. You can poke her a little bit to recognize whether or not she has it, but this won't even mean she will always show it. Especially since she can do that move into, from her dash, meaning that it's kind of hard to necessarily even notice she was going to dash. But you might want to make sure she does it, because it does affect how she does certain things in the air. On the other hand, on a day where you're just not having that much luck, or you're tired, or you don't have much time, it's not going to matter that much if she can't do it. One good way to test is actually to see if you can poke her to get her to do the running B, but this isn't consistent enough that we would suggest spending a lot of time on the test for this. But if you do see a running B at any point of this doing things, then you know you've got it right. Overall though, just try to get the dash in and don't spend too much time thinking about whether or not it actually is working. This input is allowed to be super simple because we don't really want her dashing all that much, and this move does go into a lot of things. With certain correct timings, it also helps you get her specific other moves. Action 3 is another relatively simple input. It is the same as the input from the previous bots. A jump cancelled 1C. If you charge this C, it's perfectly fine. It doesn't really affect anything too heavily. It affects Enkidu in a slightly positive way. It mostly moves him further forward. And that's about it, honestly. It does more damage, moves him further forward, but it doesn't really make it less punishable or anything. So if you don't get it, it's not that big a deal. It simply changes whether or not Mika's jumping C is charged in both incarnations of it or not. And by both incarnations, I of course refer to Action 4. But this is specifically 1C, 9, 1 end, jump cancel. Action 4, however, is a bit harder to do. This is a charge 6C with a hidden throw, i.e. 6AD as well. You can do it almost immediately right after hitting the C, but make sure to set up your buttons correctly for this, as you do still have to hold the C quite a while. And then we're going to turn this into something like a dash. In other words, once you have hit the AD, release the stick or pad to go back to neutral. You could still be holding C all this time. Hit 6 again, release again to go back to neutral, and end with the stick or pad at neutral. And you of course have to do this quite fast because the result you need is a dash. The result of this should be that if you're fast enough, the first 6C will be treated as the second part of the dash input, and the C charge will make the game read it in such a way that she gets the move you're seeing now. It can be a little bit difficult to get the dash C itself. It's not usually too difficult to get the throw, and the timing for the throw is not that strict. However, the overall duration of this input can affect the quality of the bot, so try to keep it low. If you normally do it, you should be ending the recording just around the time she's actually doing the 6C attack, and not too much longer than that. And finally, our action 5 is a 4B 6B plus C, which actually doesn't do the force function on its own. It will in fact do the second part of her standing B, which is the big blast. But it does, of course, let her have her force function hidden in something so she's not constantly spamming it, but rather has the potential to do another move instead. From there, you are going into a 3-2-1, ending at down back, and ending the recording as quickly as possible. This can be replayed into itself, as you're seeing here, to result in a quarter circle back, leading to her having her command grab. And she will have her command grab both with the B version and the A version from Action 1 if you didn't try to change that around. You can do other little OS style tweaks to get even more, but it's usually not worth your time, as again she's mostly an easy bot for helping you understand spacing, and having her do Mika trickiness is more advanced and something you should probably aim for eventually, but not really that helpful. So before we go into point systems, let's take a quick look at what this input set does on other characters. The stream is overall going to be short otherwise, so we're actually going to go through them all a bit and use a bit more explanation of bot theory to help you tweak bots as you need to, and explain why things do or don't work very well here. Note that since this does not have a 2-2 motion, it basically isn't going to do a whole set of moves for any character that has 2-2 anything. So we're taking Hyde as the first person to be shown here, and just be aware that he'll be missing related moves. In general, this bot is again about spacing and poking. It's not really to the level of footsies, because it really depends on certain aspects of the character's strengths. Which of their normals are good versus not good. If the character shares a lot of good normals with the inputs that Mika and Enkidu use, then you get a good bot, and if they don't, then you don't. You can literally look it up and decide beforehand if the bot is likely to be good or not in the strict sense. But, regardless of this, it does help you get a difference than what you're normally used to facing with bots, and can be used as a refresher course in various ways to help you understand, oh wait, this character doesn't need to be played this way, it can just do these other things that are usually kind of slow, kind of boring, but it helps you understand aspects of them that just aren't in other inputs of the same bot type, or potentially not in ones that we gave with the impression that they should be good. In other words, the bot is simple enough and clean enough that it will show you many of a character's normals that you may not have seen before because you were not using any bot other than the one given, and the one given for that character might just not use those normals much. Even if they're decent, sometimes we don't fit them all in. But as you can see here with Hyde, he's not too special in this regard. You can see most of the things you would normally have seen from him in both of the Hyde bots. But he's not terrible, and he doesn't spam as much of his uppercut, and he doesn't basically use his projectile at all, meaning that you're basically playing a footsie style game with him for a long period. Other than that, there's not too much to understand. He does a lot of his quarter circle back style move because he doesn't really have too much else to be doing. And that mostly covers it. Despite the fact that this sort of thing does have an input that generally gives the capacity to use a quarter circle forward move, even in the perfect versions, which we have input because this is quite good, bots don't often do this move because of the rhythm involved in it. Despite the fact that you would think, well, they could just cancel it there, the game may have some ways of making sure that if you charge a C button as your first forward button, it doesn't actually always do those things. So don't be surprised if even though you've got your action 1 and you have your action 4 and you're absolutely sure these are both right, that somehow your bot just doesn't tend to do their quarter circle forward move very much. And most of the time you don't actually care. If you find the move really important, then you can probably try figuring out the correct rhythm to cause it to happen more, and be much more careful with your action 1. And there will be, of course, times where the player just happens to hit on that particular timing and gets quote-unquote lucky. But even when this is true, you're still looking at a lot of only when action 1 plays into action 4, but action 1 didn't do its own move, which is very few situations, because it either generally will be doing its own move or being hidden in the animation of something else. So it's a relatively smaller chance, and it'll often surprise you for them to use this move at all. Moving on, therefore, we'll just go straight down the list to the next character. In this case, Lyn, of course. Lyn isn't so bad with this input, but she tends to be kind of spammy in a weird way. Since so many of the things we were doing with Lyn before are close-ish to this, and she doesn't have the same input requirements, she has different priorities on her moves and similar, she tends to move around fairly well, honestly, but spends a lot of time just trying to poke at you and not doing much else. This is unsurprising as the Mika and Enkidu bots are spawned off from the Lyn bot and Carmine bot. Mostly making sure that certain small parts were taken out. But you still have a lot of what should be going on. Mostly what you lose is the throw pressure and the good dash up stuff. With those gone, you could consider her a less effective version of Lyn, but just know that if you really wanted to just switch and practice on Lyn because you happened to be fighting one and wanted to learn to punish a couple moves, this will still work out well for you. It may not keep you on your toes against all of Lyn's options, but it's still enough to make sure that you're still punishing things correctly, understanding certain spacing she has, and so on, because so many of the inputs are similar. In her case, you might want to spend a lot more time trying to make sure that the forward C and the I don't even know what to call that input, the 4, 3, 2, 1 and action 1 interact in a way that specifically results in her throwing out projectiles, because her Kuga and EX Kuga are quite good for it, and if you did get it to work that way, know that this is going to be even better. But again, since it's not really super important, and even with her, she tends to end up hiding a lot of animations, or hiding the animations for action 1 and a lot of other things, it's less likely. Action 1 tends to follow either a dashing move or an actual full animated move, meaning that there's much less times where she just does action 1 as a standing thing, just whiff, stand A, and so on. And that's the main limiter. She can do those things, and if after that she goes into Action 4, she can do things like her Kuga on a good day. But it's still going to be quite rare. And you therefore shouldn't be all that stressed out if you don't manage to input it at all that way, because again, if you wanted Linbot, you would have put in Linbot, especially since it's relatively easy to change between the two of them if you understand the basic principles of bot inputs. Moving on to next character, therefore. Wallstein does not benefit too much from this. He's not terrible. This is very close to the spam bot, as you'd expect, given that the Lin and Carmine bots are functionally our spam bot, and this is a change that doesn't really take away anything Wallstein's really trying to do. In fact, it gives him a nice addition in his own running C, so it's definitely worth your time a bit. The similarity between this bot input and this spam bot is quite helpful if you are not a particularly mashy player. While Mika and Enkidu are specifically good for if you are a mashy player and need to learn to not do it, these bots are really not that spammy, which means that you tend to get away with trying to hit them fairly often. They don't specifically defend themselves, nor do they build up a lot of space or screen control, even with the normals they use. So Wallstein is decent. He will help you remember certain parts of the matchup, learn to watch for them so you can punish them correctly, but he's not going to be overwhelming or anything. Just understand his options and deal with his spacing, and you're probably fine. Do we not suggest it? No. This won't teach you any bad habits or anything, probably. You'll end up with a limited concept of what the character does, if you use this one as your main one a lot, but it still helps occasionally to help you get some experience with his 6-6C, and that's about it, really. Therefore, moving on again. As mentioned, Carmine is similar to this bot because obviously he has all of these things. The 6B+C helps make this a little bit easier. He loses most of his air game, even though he does still have a jump, he just doesn't seem to end up with it rhythm-wise. And tends to advance a bit too much without actually getting anything out of it. So unlike Lin, our verdict here is, if you really need Carmine bot, like, switch to Carmine. As in, switch the inputs to actually have Carmine bot. He is still, however, functional enough if you just need to, like, practice blocking the overhead and maybe keeping yourself at the right spacing, which is, again, what this is often for. Learning to keep yourself at the right spacing versus Carmine is less important than certain other characters, as he's often going to set up the spacing he wants himself, and your job is to prevent that. But if you happen to have a character that benefits strongly from taking up a very specific space against Carmine, and you don't have time to put in Carmine bot, or just happen to have the other one in and want a little practice, you can use it for approximately that purpose. Other than that, he spends a lot of time whiffing things that he doesn't really need to be whiffing, and again, whether or not he does the spinning blade has a lot more to do with how you did particular parts of the input. So that's all we actually have to say about him, honestly. Let's move on. Generally, as a character, Oria tends to be difficult to build secondary bots for. Her high mobility actually means that she becomes less and less functional when she's not set specifically on her own rhythm, which is why the Wagner version was actually quite lucky, as it wasn't really intended to make an Oria bot, but it just turned out to be the best way to generally make one. We probably have ended up with one eventually out of other things, but it's good that we got her off early. As you can see here, therefore, she's able to do quite a lot of moves. She's able to reposition herself quite well, but it's done with so little, let's say, intent, that mostly it helps you learn to block her from the air, and most of the time you more so want to anti-air. Still, depending on your character and how much time you want to spend trying to get into the air yourself, or having to worry about coming down at your opponent when they have just jumped at you, you can still get a little bit out of this. Still, this is closer to what we suggest. No, don't spend a lot of time on it, don't bother. Because if your defense is good, this bot is really unlikely to be a threat, other than to be frustrating or confusing. It'll help you understand Ori as a character, but if you've gotten this far into any of our bot content, you already understand this well enough. And honestly, despite the fact that the inputs are technically more complicated, the physical act of inputting the Wagner bot is about the same as this, honestly, if not easier. So, Oria is not recommended here. If you needed Oria for some reason, you could probably get the same or better experience from the Wagner bot type, Oria, i.e. Oria bot herself. It does let you see her 3B, I guess. Once again, moving on. Gordo is actually fairly good here. Gordo has a lot of moves that involve him going forward at you. And while he does obviously lose his scythe and his pressure form of it, he honestly can manage fairly well without a lot of those things for a long time if fighting certain characters or in certain matchups. And as you know from the rest of it, him having his 6-6C is just useful. Even more interestingly, because of his particular animations, his rhythm is way better than most of the other bots in terms of getting like the uppercut style motion out of this or other things. The 3B allows for a lot of uppercut style stuff, but the rhythm normally doesn't make it possible. So even though you don't see much of the actual 3B in many of the bots, except in Mika herself, because of her rhythm, it's still decent. For example, you could similarly notice that despite the fact that we specifically put a 3B in, there's a lot of characters where that didn't seem to do too much, and you don't really benefit too much from it on Gordo other than it doing more lows. You can think of it as a long-range keep-out style Gordo though, that might help, and this might not be a waste of your time. So he's on the upper list of characters that are actually worth doing something with this bot as it is exactly. Which is particularly helpful because if you can't get the Gordo bot in for some reason, or just met up with this character type and understood him otherwise, but didn't have trouble getting in because he was just randomly doing things, this is closer to an effective Gordo spam bot than a lot of other things would be. can help you learn a couple of the things from there, even though you can't learn most of it. But once again, therefore, let us advance. Merkava's not as effective with these inputs. He does show you a couple more things. They are different enough from the Merkava bot that you might learn something from it. But mostly neither his rhythm nor his actual approach to it are good unless you jump a lot. If you have a character that relies a lot on aerial approaches though, he might be at least somewhat worth your time because he tends to defend himself in such a long, strongly spaced way, and often to do his long-reaching hit, which tends to grab people out of the air, something that you see a lot less in the actual Merkava bot because it's not really that great a move to be just spamming randomly. Meaning that if you specifically needed to learn to deal with this or outmaneuver it or learn the timings where he could easily do it, because you jump a lot and Merkava bot was not really helping you out as a result of that, well, here's something that can help you out in its place. Certain rhythm things and slightly OS style cross-uppy things allow him to get a couple more moves if you're really close to him that don't always seem to make sense. But overall, he's not going to be too terribly stressful. If you recognize the same style of flip over, that is actually valid. That is from his 6-6C, which is actually more or less the same move and animation as his 3C. So again, putting him on the short list of, okay, this might actually be worth my time, but it's more so for characters who need to spend a lot of time in the air, spend a lot of time thinking about it, and have to respect the fact that he can, let's say, spam certain moves, and this will let him deal with your air approaches fairly well. So now that Merkava has very blatantly demonstrated himself, we will once again move on. As you'd expect, Batista is nearly useless. There are ways to mess with these inputs such that they might make Batista slightly better, but being basically the only real charge character in the game means that she obviously doesn't work well with most bot inputs other than her own. So a direct contrast to Merkava, because she doesn't really have a lot of moves, by most standards, that the player must learn about in the same timings or spacings. She should still have the same 6-6C, but another aspect of her in particular is that once again her rhythm is really different than you'd expect because of the animations of other things she does. For example, you can see with her that you end up seeing the throw a lot more, like actually seeing her whiff the throw. This concept of rhythm in bots is a large part of the development work involved, learning where to put which pieces of the bot to prevent certain moves from happening, or to increase the chances that they will. But short version is, there is probably no timing you can input these inputs with where you have managed to get a working Mika and Enkidu bot and yet still a worthwhile Batista. So, ironically, bottom tier. and we will once again proceed. The relative complexity of certain of Seth's inputs, and his tendency to dive kick out of everything once he uses them, means that he's also not really that great for this. He can be played in a very slightly footsie character-ish way, as a standard thing, but he doesn't have the greatest 3B, and he doesn't have the greatest range. But because he also has a lot of his specific moves suppressed, you're not going to get a whole lot out of this either. Fortunately, his rhythm is such that even though technically you'd expect him to not use most of his moves, if you poke at him, he actually will. Which is a good thing to learn about his trickiness from. Honestly, therefore, this is not necessarily a Seth Bot 2.0, because you couldn't come up with a point system for it. But if it was just, ugh, I can't keep track of this character, especially combined with, why does he keep whiffing buttons that don't do anything, then this is not bad. The bot will nearly never manage to get Vorpal, and basically not even remotely approach a setup. And similarly, if you simply decided, I'm going to defend now, and not let you hit me, then you're not likely to get very far. But he's closest in spirit to Mika and Enkidu. I.e., if you mash a lot against Seth while he's in this form, bot form, you might actually take a lot of damage. And there are things you can learn from it if you find yourself to be a mashy person whose idea of defending against a character like Seth is to manage to hit him as quickly as possible so that you don't have to deal with it anymore. That said, it also means that there are times when you really can just mash out of his stuff, because he's not doing cohesive stuff. The Wagner bot version of him does cohesive things. The buttons have a purpose, but you see most of the same buttons. So this mostly comes down to the fact that his overhead, his own 6C, and a couple other things are in here. You get to see them, you get to interact with them, maybe learn any strange interactions your character has with them. But if you're not really mashy, or if you are really mashy but like completely dedicated to it, you're not likely to get much out of it. You have to be that sort of person who is trying to control their mashiness, but then not, and then maybe Seth can help you. So onward once again. This is going to be relatively unnecessary for the Eltnum bot, mind you, because everything we can find about how Eltnum works means that she's not going to share any inputs with anyone. Yuzuriha is fairly functional here. This has a lot to do with, again, rhythm. The force function is hidden in the correct place. There's a lot of holding of the C. Or at least there can be quite a lot of holding of C. Her 4A to B isn't really bad for anything. The problem is that this version of Yuzuriha keeps on approaching and keeps on attacking. She's not really giving even the impression that she's watching and waiting for you. So once again, it depends. If you're the sort of player who is so defensive that even Yuzu must try to get in on you, definitely give this a shot. So like Hilda players can give this a try, some Gordeau players, Yuzu Mirror players if they want to learn how to do that for some reason. But if you're the sort of person that thrives off being close to your opponent, either through you going in or them getting close to you and you doing stuff, this won't teach you anything about this character really. And she doesn't even really do moves that she doesn't otherwise do in her own bot. So A tier if you are defensive to the point where you are the one zoning Yuzura, and completely useless otherwise. But speaking of zoners, onward! Hilda's rhythm on this bot is confusing because she somehow seems to end up actually doing her force function. No matter what we do. Even though technically there doesn't seem to be any reason she should by the timing she has for everything else. Yet it is there. And you do have to be concerned about this somewhat as the player, so it's not terrible to have to learn it. Fortunately, she has both her 1B and her 3B, which doesn't necessarily make her more effective as a bot, as she doesn't really do the projectiles or similar. But again, if you're the sort that jumps a lot, you can get a similar feeling to Merkava. If you find that you jump a lot to get in on characters like this, maybe give this a try, maybe see if you can control your instincts or see your own spacing well enough to understand when you should not do it, and it might help improve your game against her. But no promises, as we didn't actually do a whole lot of testing on her. She basically is either on or off, and there may be configurations of her timing which lead to this not really being effective at all. By some reasoning, she already isn't that effective, honestly. I can't say the spam bot is better, but depending on where you want to stand, it's definitely not a fabulous incarnation. Shifting therefore to our next character, the results would be, in this case, more or less as you'd expect as well. Chaos isn't a character that works well with this bot input type. The charged Cs do help somewhat, but honestly he's not any more useful than Enkidu, and he mostly uses Aji much less, as well as not having a specifically good timing for anything he's trying to do, making it relatively easy to get in on him, and he doesn't put up any real pressure. This is because he's not really a poking character for the most part, and giving him a lot of pokey style flow just means that he ends up letting you out of his setups when he eventually does get them on you fairly easily. The lack of specials furthermore compounds this, meaning that he doesn't tend to call Aji much at all, and therefore results in being almost completely useless for actually learning basically anything. This is the first time, therefore, that technically Chaos has been worse than Batista. When he's good, within even this, he seems really competent, but it takes so long for the stars to align for him to look competent enough that we mostly don't care. And therefore, can proceed. Nanase is difficult to tell because she's actually one of the characters who is most affected by whether or not you have certain rhythms in the bot. It can be a little difficult to say whether or not this would turn out well at all, but we do know that with the 6B plus C she should have a decent fly, and given that it will be hidden a lot of things, and often the execution of it should follow right after some other things. She doesn't always have an air move that does anything out of it. She should have a fairly good spread of, am I going forward, am I going backward? Much less predictable with the use of the force function than normally we see in bots when we attempt to use her. However, her rhythm is usually bad because she will do the uppercut style motion more, and hers doesn't even go anywhere, so you're just waiting for her to land and then get beaten. She throws out some surprisingly good combos sometimes. And of course does have her dashing C, so it's not cohesive for most people. If you find that you have a character who Nanase doesn't get away with using her projectile much against, then you might find this bot useful. Because it effectively attempts to simulate playing Nanase functionally. This is, again, much more functional than most of our Nanase forms, without using the projectile and mostly aiming to whiff punish you with long normals and specific specials, which is honestly not that bad. It's obviously a way that you're going to see certain matchups get played at the lower levels, but we wouldn't expect this to stand up to much scrutiny as an actual bot for teaching you things. It's also not necessarily specifically spammy, in that it's not spamming moves that will actually like give it any advantage. She just does moves, and usually they're very punishable, but they're also not hidden or tricky, they're mostly telegraphed. Still, if you are the sort of player who is, again, being very zoney and doesn't really have to respect Nanase's fireball, so she probably doesn't want to throw it, you can definitely still give this a look and see if you learn anything about how her long poking normals can be used to protect her from things and where you need to be careful. But that is all we have to say about her. Byakuya loses most of his functionality in bots where he hits a lot of C. But he does fortunately here have quite a lot of force function usage at good rhythm timings. And both his uppercut and his quarter circle back moves. Even though he does end up being one of those characters who doesn't have the rhythm required to do the uppercut style move too much. He still does it often enough that you have to care. So unlike our actual spam bot, where the Byakuya version is just terrible, you could think of this as the opposite side. Nanase and Byakuya are good on this one, but not the other one. Which is somewhat useful as if you really needed to make a quick switch. Again, the inputs aren't that hard to do. In fact, the action 3 and action 1 are exactly the same. And the action 2, and to some extent 5, are relatively easy to put in. Your biggest problem normally turns out to be action 4. Still, he's not really playing cohesive Byakuya, and he's not really anywhere near as good as Byakuya Bot, as a lot of his movement ends up being repetitive, and he's, again, basically this is the Byakuya spam bot variant, presumably because the other one was so awful at the job. So you can keep that in mind if you ever need to use it. But as he's not cohesive enough to actually talk about much things he does, or any actual plans here, we will once again move on. Part of the reason for all of this specific is that we have reached, again, the end of the bots, more or less. We don't expect Elton to share much of anything with anyone. We may not go through this with her at all. So we want to make it as clear as possible why certain things work or don't, so that you can make your decisions. Phone on is spammy. Not super spammy, not like this is actually a spam bot level spammy, but she does a lot of things that are more so intended to take up space than make sense. And there's a form of player who plays phone on like that. It's not even ineffective. This bot's choices of moves for the purpose, however, are fairly bad. It is a good test for one thing. If you fight this bot and it beats you up too much, there's a decent chance that you are a little bit too overzealous in this matchup, and are not used to the idea of a character with this much range at this speed. So you can use it to help yourself learn to slow down, so that you don't just get pummeled by phone-on style characters or long-range style characters repeatedly. And again, as this is technically going to be in our easy bot section, if you happen to come back to watch this disc guidance based on that, and you're going through the bots by difficulty, then sure, give it a try, because you might not yet be used to the idea of the sort of full screen footsies and very complicated zoning that this game can sometimes include. And our phone-on bot isn't really about doing it this way, nor is it particularly easy to input most of the time. But again, this is more so about if you find yourself getting hit because you misjudge ranges, if you just have trouble getting in because that's the most natural form to have against phone-on, then it's not necessarily going to teach you anything. This is literally just emotion. It's going to teach you to not move quite so close, not move quite so much, not move quite so fast. But beyond that, it's not really a strong phone-on or particularly educational one. Bringing us right around again. Well, we obviously don't need to go over Mika in that regard. So onward to Wagner. And we see that she ends up good at pushing on you fairly hard. Whereas the actual Wagner bot spends a lot more time like spacing itself, this is just in your face all the time. And it's not honestly that good at it. So you can treat it very similarly to phone-on. If you realize you're losing to this, you're probably moving too much. She doesn't power up Sword and Shield in this form either. Even with certain variants, she probably won't do it that much because of rhythm. And we don't really consider it to be the superior form of even the spam bot for her. It's just Wagner not being that great. That said, if you really need to learn to punish a couple easy Wagner things to get people off you, this might be worth your time at least a bit. So we'll take our final look at Akatsuki and then go quickly into the formal forms of the point systems before we close this out. Again, we're not even going to look at Eltnum. We know how well this does not work, and it's actually completely useless. So, you'll have to wait 2 weeks for her release in her full form. Akatsuki is very similar to Hyde here, mostly whiff buttons, doesn't do anything too spectacular or particular. He does a lot more of that move, which is good to help you learn to defend against it. But other than that, mostly just jumps a little bit and doesn't even throw that many projectiles. So, overall, quick verdict, don't waste your time. This doesn't even fit the parameters required for the spam bot. And if you want an Akatsuki bot of that type, use the other one. However, if you realize you're having a lot of trouble punishing specifically his, let's call it Tatsu, then you might as well give it a run. In other words, if you do realize, oh, I'm really bad at punishing that move, but I don't want to like have to undo the whole thing to get to put in some action just to make Katsuki do it, then fear not, he already does it. Yay. Bring us back to Mika to briefly go over the actual point system. And for that, we will once again switch back to Just Fine. And Akatsuki versus Mika, specifically. Point system 1, therefore. These may be changed in order when you get to the actual page. Point system 1 is to basically punish her force function. The move is like minus 30. It's not that hard to deal with, but she does end up fairly far away from you. Depending on your options, this may be confusing depending on when she cancels it. If you decide to spam certain things, you may get hit rather than getting away. The bot will not often hit you for it. It depends heavily on some parts of the rhythm. You may find that yours does it a bit more than others. But mostly, she won't do too much. She has to get into a really fast rhythm in a lot of cases. If you input action 4 in a specific way, or input action 5 really quickly, you should see it occasionally. Next point is to punish her dash C, her 6-6 the big drop kick. This move is also quite minus. And she ends up close to you too. Most of the time, she will miss entirely if you get out of the way, leading to a functionally even bigger punish. Fairly easy to do, but this move is not really one that you easily see coming. If you play very defensively, well, she has her ways of dealing with that, which brings us to the next point, specifically, teching her throw. She can cancel her command grab out of a lot of things. The move is relatively easy to execute as well. You're just going to have to deal with it a lot of the time. But if you are focused enough on the fact that it may be coming for any number of reasons, while playing proper defense, you should be able to deal with it. The main issue is that if you focus entirely on defense and attacking that throw, it lets Mika do a lot of moves and motions that will then mislead you. Specifically her charge C, in the air particularly, and the final point system. Her 3B, which is basically her Flying Peach move. Again, there's not much to compare it to unless you are a Street Fighter player, but you can always look it up if you're the type of person who's just used to this sort of game. And of course you saw it when you input it, or could just turn on only action 2 to get a very clear look at what the move is. This move is punishable, but not always, so you have to learn the ranges at which you can punish it and with what. She will not normally block all that well after this move, but you can easily tell what was going on by whether or not you counter hit when you try to hit her. Just getting used to the ranges as a whole is fine though, and understanding how plus and minus she can be is probably enough to clarify to you what you should be hitting and get you a little understanding of frame data as a whole. But she is only moderately difficult, with the main stressors being that she tends to do quite a bit of damage and you can't just win by defending. But that does in fact cover all for her, so we will move on to the point system for Enkidu and then close out our stream for the night. Similar to Mika, Enkidu is primarily about dealing with advancing moves. However, even though it's obviously important to punish his 2C, we are not actually giving a point for punishing his 2C. Do your best to do this anyway. But his charge 2C has a bunch of other little things he does, it gets confusing. You're aiming to get a full punish on his tidal spin, his force function. Especially if you're the sort of person that mashes too much. But this is the easiest point, and you know how we go with the easy points. As soon as you move into quote-unquote medium difficulty, they go away. The next is, however, still fairly easy, just rarer. You are to punish his 6-6C, which is basically a jumping shield thing. It's quite easy to punish unless he spaces it super well, which is nearly impossible in the bot. So you just have to get used to the idea, oh, this is a move that I should be punishing. Because honestly, it can give you the impression, based on if you've played certain other games before, that it isn't all that punishable. But it definitely is. You just normally need to use very specific normals for the job. Find out which ones those are for your character, and once again, go for some optimal damage. He can't cancel it into anything, he just has to do the move and deal with whatever happens when he tries. Next, however, is the much more important blocking and punishing his charge 6C, his overhead. This move is relatively easy to punish, at least similar to the dash C. It only hits overhead if the actual kick hits you. And he doesn't tend to mess with you too much when he does it. But he does have the potential to. And if you are too mashy a player, likely bad things will happen to you. Especially if you find yourself to be the sort of mashy player who does this sort of thing to reposition yourself and not have to deal with your opponent getting to reposition. You're likely to get caught by this move quite a lot as you may move forward, recognize he's starting something and go to block, but you'll probably not know whether to block high or low as he does do both things fairly often. And of course, an easy bot would not be complete without a point system for anti-airs, except that for Enkidu in particular, this is actually hard. Most of the bots so far, when we have told you, hey, just anti-air, it actually isn't that difficult because they don't have enough reach on their air normals or enough advantage at the spacing where they want to jump to make just jumping raw and hitting a button a good idea. Enkidu is one of the few characters where this is a good idea, just outright good. If you are in the wrong position, you can just do this, and he has empty jump into counter, parry, and similar things, as well as empty jump into a bunch of other weird stuff that he does. All of this combines with a character who can just cancel a ton of things into parry and mislead you quite a lot about his spacing, even when he's going for fairly obvious looking moves. Keeping all of this in your mind and managing to still react to his jumps in time is still easy. That is why he is an easy bot, but it's not easy enough that you could probably get all your points off it, even though it is the last point system. If you're focused on enough other things that Enkidu is doing, especially since he's not just gonna spam jumping. He will jump fairly often too, but he doesn't just constantly jump spam. When they have gotten to the point where that is the only way you can get the point, and note this is specifically you do not get any points for knocking him out of the air on tidal spin or basically anything else of that particular type, where you notice a move that sends him into the air. You do not get the anti-air point for hitting him out of that. He must actually jump and usually be aiming to go for a jump normal. There is a timing in which he will actually jump empty, but it's very rare. and I mean extremely rare. But you can still get it. It's kind of like a jump cancel thing. And therefore, it actually is difficult enough to get points purely off of the anti-air, because you don't generally want to stand at a space where anti-airing Enkidu is easy or a good idea or similar. And because he has such a long potential in his jump cancel, you're going to have to deal with it a lot more often than you'd think, but not at the timing you're used to. So if you find yourself to be too twitchy a person, feel like you can't play fighting games because you don't have the chill, well, you have a fighting partner that is epically good to help you do it. Next week we should be having our usual mishmashing battle round for Street Fighter V. However, we are much less likely to have any other streams for the full week. That is, we stream Monday next week and Monday only. This has to do with a ton of other obligations that are coming up, as well as the fact that two of us are heading to Northwest Majors and will not be available for bot content or otherwise. You may still get a Friday stream, but don't count on it, and it will be completely undecided as to what it is. Probably even after next week's Monday stream, so even then, it's unlikely anyone will be able to tell you what Friday would be. Hopefully though, this has been helpful to you. Once again, you can find these bots at our website 2-mk.org/UNIST-bots. Street Fighter V and DBFZ can be found at SF5-bots and DBFZ-bots respectively. And of course, if you find anything to let us know, please hit us up at the contact page. Drop us an email and let us know if you found anything strange, or anything that needs fixing, or just anything confusing in the text of any bot release. These two bots should be released somewhere between 6 and 7 Eastern, or slightly after that on Sunday. And once again, you will get nothing for Eltnam, because she is her own thing altogether. So you're going to have to wait 2 weeks for the final UNIST bot. That all said, this has been Rillian for Team 2MK. You can find all our stuff at Twitter 2_MK_FGC, so pay attention there. Otherwise, good luck with your training this weekend, and good night, everyone.